fastest ones don't always win. It's the one who outlasts the competition, the one who never quits. But what if the race isn't just about you? What if the grind, hard work, and sacrifice of your every step is meant to pave the way for the one who comes after you? Your preparation, relentless effort, and perseverance become somebody else's starting point. And when you cross the finish line, you realize it's not the finish line at all. Your legacy lives on. You're just getting started. You're an outlaster.
Well, hey friends, I'm Scott. I want to say it's good to be with you guys, and thanks for joining in this weekend as we are in part 3 of our series, Outlasters. We've been saying, hey, this is a series that is based off of running the race of life and running it well. And so we've said, it requires running life with the type of focus, the determination, the grit needed to kind of win the race that we're in. But that immediately points to a question that we begin to ask where we say, hey, well, what is actually the win? What's the point and what are we doing here? And so how do I know I'm supposed to be, doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing? Because that's what happens when we play a game, right? When we're in a race or we're doing something for the first time and we're not really sure how it works, we say, well, what am I supposed to be doing here? How do I know, the rules? And I need some clarity on how I win. And so, as we started off this series, we began by taking a look at the life of the Apostle Paul. Paul is somebody whose life just rippled into, created these waves into history. And Paul was this person who it was clear for him, he had a very clarified win. So for Paul, the win was obvious. It was always people. Paul wanted to live his life in such a way where he was able to influence as many people as possible in a way that was drawing them closer to the kingdom of God. And then last week, we looked at one of the first of two qualities that we said, hey, these are going to be essential for the type of lives that are going to be lives that outlast our own. And the first one that we looked at was the quality of resilience. We said that resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, it's toughness, and we said that it is the strength and speed of our responses to adversity, and we can actually build resilience in our lives. And so, as we talked about that, we dove into a passage that was written by James. James is the brother of Jesus. And James actually, he honestly said some really strange things that might catch us off guard related to it, but it's really this different way of looking at life. And in this letter, he said, I want you to consider it just pure joy. Pure joy whenever you find yourself surrounded by trials of many kinds. And we might hear that and be like, James, well, he is related to Jesus, so I have to be polite. But James, like, what? Like who does that? Who lives that way? And shouldn't I just want to get through the trials? Shouldn't I pray that God saves me from those trials? But as he continued, we saw that we find joy during these times because we know that something actually bigger is going on underneath the surface. Because it's during these times that we're able to develop a type of perseverance or endurance as a result of it. That God uses trials and adversity to develop resilience in us. And that actually prepares us for the things that are ahead of us. And so James encouraged us that even though we're often desperate just to get past those circumstances, that God will use them to develop resilience within us that will allow us to get through them and allow us to be on our way to becoming outlasters with our lives. We said, hey, if we want to run our race in such a way where we get to the end of our lives and our legacies live on, we need resilience. We need it not just for ourselves, but for those who are coming after us. But there's something else that we need if we want to live the life of an outlaster, and that is where we're headed today. So Lyle asked a question related to school coming back in, and it's been a couple weeks for our household that the kids have been back in school. But over summer, we were able to enjoy a really nice family vacation. And so we headed up the coast, and we spent a week like on a California road trip. And it was fun. We went to Big Sur, then we headed up to San Francisco, and then the Sequoias. And we had a great time. We were really grateful for the opportunity that we had. And while we were on this trip, maybe as you can imagine these places if you've been there, we encountered these incredible bridges, like where we were driving. So there's Bixby that's in the Big Sur area, and then there's Golden Gate, there's the Bay Bridge, right? And so whether or not it was a small bridge or a longer bridge, what happened is the kids would do something that would be kind of fun. Every bridge that we would cross, they decided that they would need to hold their breath, right? And so when it's just a couple seconds, it's fine. When it's the Bay Bridge, it's like, buddy, you're going to pass out again, right? So like, it was fun. And honestly, for me, I'm not somebody who's necessarily like afraid of heights or anything like that. But I will just say that every now and then we're driving along a bridge and I just think about this. I'm like, Scott, there's no guarantee that this thing doesn't collapse right now. Which is just get in your head and you're like, oh man, I'm ruined for the day, right? Or at least until we cross the bridge. Happy to report everything went well, which you're like, oh, but I recently came upon this article. It was great. It's entitled, Why Do Bridges Collapse? 5 Reasons You Should Be Scared. And I thought it was really thoughtful. They only included 5 reasons for me to be freaked out about it. But as I read about this, I was reminded of the importance of what's referred to as structural integrity. And that is the ability for a structure to withstand its intended load without failing due to fracture or fatigue. And so when the structural integrity of something is sound, well, then everything works the way it's supposed to. The kids hold their breath, you take beautiful pictures, and everything is great. However, if a load-bearing structure fails, well, that's a different thing, because the load then becomes transferred to and it potentially overloads the surrounding support structures. So in other words, because of one part's failures, the others around it are forced to bear more weight than they were ever intended to bear. And sometimes they collapse due to the increase of pressure and weight. And as I was reading this, I immediately drew this comparison that came to my mind, because I think for a lot of us, we've seen families or businesses or even churches and they fall apart. And they fall apart due to a lack of personal failure. The lack of actually personal integrity of maybe just one person. And just like the bridges, when that personal failure happens, well, the stress and the weight and the pain of it all is transferred to the people that were around them. And in fact, we've seen times where the lack of personal integrity from one person or maybe even a parent, that leads to or causes just this spiral into generational dysfunction, all because of that one lack of integrity. See, if we want to run our race in such a way where we get to the end of our lives and our legacies live on, we define our win and we develop resilience. But there's something else that we need if we want to become outlasters, and that is actually a type of authority. And here's what I mean by that. I think every single person of influence will exercise authority on one or two levels. And one level is, it's immediately obvious and it's very apparent. The other, it actually becomes apparent after a little bit of time. One level, it speaks to a person's influence within a defined context, while the other speaks to their influence beyond that context. And the first area of authority that I'm talking about is what we would refer to as positional authority. And people with positional authority, they have influence because of the position that they have. So there's a reason why you listen when somebody demands that you take off your shoes in the airport. And it's because they are a TSA agent, hopefully, right? And so there's a reason, like they have a defined set of authority within that context where you go, yeah, it's just expected that I will listen to them. And people with positional authority, their bosses and their parents, or their teachers, their police officers, there's a lot of different types of positional authority. And the position that they hold, it just kind of inherently commands a level of authority within that defined context. And do we encounter people who don't show respect to the people with those areas of authority? And yeah, we absolutely do. But the question of, well, why should I listen to you is, well, it's because of the position, because of the role, the title, or the authority that they have within that context. And so that's positional authority. But then there's a second type of authority, and this is one that actually all outlasters have. In fact, the people who often have the greatest amount of influence over us are sometimes people who have little to no positional authority, but they're these people. They're the people who have moral authority in our lives. Moral authority is something that exists when there's a type of alignment between a person and what they say and how they live. It's when their walk and their talk line up, right? So this is a person who lives with, keyword, integrity. And this is the word where we link our other words like integer or integrate. A person of integrity is somebody who is a whole person, someone who is undivided, someone who lives without compromise within themselves. And so these are the people with moral authority who as children, we saw them, we saw their character, we saw their integrity, and we went, wow, they are heroes. Those are the type of people that I want to become. And these are the people who, as we get older and we see areas that need leadership, we go, you know what? We need people of strong moral authority in positional authority leadership because we respect them, we admire them, we'd be willing to listen to them, and we know that the world needs more people like them. And here's the thing that's true of us all, is that there have been plenty of people and plenty of times where we've seen someone and there's a stark contrast between what they say and what they expect of others and how they live and what they expect of themselves, right? And some of these people who say, hey, take my advice, I'm not using it. Some of these people are, well, they're our coaches, right? The people who are screaming, you know, run faster. And you're like, I don't think you've exercised in years. Some of those people have been our bosses, the ones who are going, I need you to sacrifice for the good of the company. And then you're thinking, you know what? I don't think you would ever entertain the thought of making a decision that you didn't personally benefit from. And some of these people have been our relatives, people that were, you know, an aunt or an uncle or maybe a parent, someone whose rules we were very well acquainted with, but once we were old enough to kind of see things a little bit more clearly, we discovered that they actually never intended to follow those standards themselves. And though some of these people may have had positional authority over us, the less alignment that we would see, the less integrity that they had, well, the less moral authority they had and the less influence they had on our lives. And here's the unfair thing about moral authority, is that there are people who took years or even decades to build it, but then they completely lost it in a single unguarded moment where we saw them lose their integrity when they made a short-sighted compromise. When we see a lack of integrity, a lack of character, we begin to lose respect for people, and when we lose respect for them, they begin to lose influence in our lives. But the great news is true, is that the opposite of this is also valid, is that people who have moral authority in our lives are people who have built up trust with us, people we've seen do the right thing, even when it costs them, and these are the people who have made a lasting impression on us in such a way where we not only admire them, but the way they live and the things that they say, well, they have just this extra weight in our lives. You see, you can be a leader without integrity. You can be a leader without moral authority. And how do we know this is true? Because we see people who are all around us leading without integrity all the time. And maybe they have positional authority, but we know that you can be a leader without moral authority. However, you cannot be a leader worth following. You cannot be an outlaster without it. Which begs the question, so if we want to become outlasters, how do we become people of moral authority? And so in our passage today, we're going to look at a couple snapshots of the life of somebody you might be really familiar with, even if you're not familiar with a lot of the stories or the characters within the Bible. It's someone you might go, okay, I know this person to be a person who's like a hero of the faith. And that is true, but what I want us to realize is that we will discover he was a hero even before he had the opportunity to prove it. So the year is 605 BC, and King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he has defeated the Egyptian and the Assyrian armies, and he's flexing his muscles. He's setting up vassal states everywhere between Egypt and Babylon. And so he shows up to Jerusalem, and he goes to the capital city of Judah. And it's there that Nebuchadnezzar, he removes the king from the throne, he sets up another ruler, and he's about to head back to Babylon. But before he does, he wants to take some souvenirs with him. And so we jump into Daniel chapter 1 at verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had brought to Babylon as captives. And what we want to see here is that Nebuchadnezzar is making a really crafty choice and decision. He's going to the most important, influential families in Judah, and he's kidnapping their best and their brightest. He takes them back to Babylon, and he begins to indoctrinate them in all things Babylonian culture. But it is a great way to ensure that their families back in Judah, they're not going to give him any issues, that they're going to be listening to him, because he's got their sons. He's got the cream of the crop of Judah. The story continues. He says, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. Make sure they're all well-versed in every branch of learning. They're gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and they're suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. So the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So quick review. Is you have been taken from your homeland, which has been invaded. Your people are under foreign rule, but then you have been hand-selected to live in or around the Babylonian palace. You get to receive training and education. You're not forced to go to war, to work for slave labor or do major construction. And oh yeah, by the way, did you catch, you've got a meal plan that's set up for you. And so you're thinking, if that's me, like, I've got it made. Like, I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to blow it. I've won the lottery. And these guys are alive at a time when most people were living meal to meal, always on the brink of starvation. But now they've got a guarantee that they will always have food. They will never go hungry. They will always have a roof over their heads as long as they just stay in line with the program. Wow. And so they're trained to enter the king's service so Nebuchadnezzar could show off to the world who's watching, this is the nation of Babylon. Look at us. We have the best and the brightest of the whole world right here in Babylon. Verse 6, it continues. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was called Abednego. And what we know is you've done this before where you get a pet, and the pet used to have this other name, but you rename that. You're like, that name didn't work for me. And so I renamed, it's no longer Sparky, but it's Tom. And you know that you rename something that you own and that you have the authority over, right? And so that's this flex that's going on there. These young men, they're given new Babylonian names, and the names are actually linked to Babylonian gods. And we're told that among this group was a teenager known as Daniel. And Daniel had it made. I mean, everything is what you would hope for. But then the story takes a strange twist in verse 8. But Daniel was determined, and that word, it means resolved, like set his heart. He had made up his mind that he would not defile, like to pollute or stain himself by eating the food and the wine given to them by the king. And so he asked the chief of staff, hey, could I actually have permission not to eat these unacceptable foods? To which, if you hear this, you're going, hey, Daniel, can we talk real quick? And you pull him aside and you say, what are you doing? Like, how foolish can you be? Okay, this is not the point to make. You're not in Jerusalem anymore, buddy. You're in Babylon. Right? And so they have assured you that you will have food to eat, and so you eat it, right? They have created this program, and this is not the time for you to make this strange religious objection that they aren't going to understand. It's only going to isolate you more from them. Eat the food. For Daniel, he goes, well, I can't. Like, my mind is already made up. And as we look at that, we're going, okay, what's at play here? And we might think, well, is it like a kosher thing? Is it a dietary law thing? But it actually probably has a lot less to do with that than something else that was going on. The part of the Babylonian culture was that before they would present this food to the king and the palace and the people that were going to be eating it, they presented this food to the gods that they worshiped, right? And so for Daniel, he's going, hey, to consume the food, that would be like participating in or aligning myself with the worship of these gods that I am not going to follow, and I am not about what they stand for. So Daniel, he makes this decision. He says, I've already made up my mind that I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to be linked to these gods. I don't want anybody thinking that the good that comes out of my life is the result of these gods. And the crazy thing is that Daniel, as I'm saying, he has made up his mind already. He's made up his mind before he knows how the story is going to play out, before he knows that we're going to read about it a couple thousand years later, that everything's just okay. He made up his mind before he knew if this was going to cost him his life. And that's something we just say, wow, that's conviction. Verse 9. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, okay, Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. See, if you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. It continues. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He says, well, just please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. And at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. And then just go ahead, then make your decision in light of what you see. So the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends, they looked healthier, they looked better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. And as we see this, we go, okay, Daniel, he has made up his mind. He's laying it all on the line, and he is trusting God with the outcome. And it's wild, it's shocking, but when we understand his heart behind it, it's amazing. He's going, okay, you know what you could do? Is you could kidnap me from my homeland, you can cut my hair, you could change my name if you want to. I'll speak other languages, but be sure of this, is that my devotion, my obedience, my allegiance, my dedication, it will only be found in my worship of my God, the Lord. And that stands out to those who are watching, right? They take notice. They not only see that Daniel and his friends, they look healthier, they look stronger, right? But they see the way that they're living. People see that Daniel is so different from everyone else, and he begins to gain favor in Babylon. And this continues. In verse 21, it tells us that Daniel, he actually remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus, to which we gloss over it and go, cool story, bro. But that's almost 70 years. Nearly 7 decades of him living his life completely committed and devoted to the Lord his God, and people going, I like this guy. And all the while, they're watching him, and he's gaining influence because of the type of life that he's living. And so now, a few years later, as Darius, a new king, is in power, he's setting up his leadership structure, his cabinet, and he's deciding, okay, who do I need in position? And guess who he wants to give positional authority to? In chapter 6, verse 1, we read this. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. And I love this. Like, Darius is going, okay, I need help keeping an eye on this whole empire. And so, I'm obviously going to loop Daniel into this. And eventually, Daniel proves himself to be so trustworthy in this role that the king is thinking, Daniel, like, I would trust him to do the whole thing for me. But there are a bunch of other people, and they're looking on, and they're jealous. They're envious of the type of influence and type of authority that's being extended to Daniel. And so what we see in verse 4 is that then the other administrators and high officers, they began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs. But here's the thing. They couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. I love this. It's like, how good is that? That these people, they decide, we have got to find some dirt on this guy. So they go through everything. They go through his history. They go through his emails, all that kind of stuff. He checks out, right? They're going, the only thing that we could find is that he's faithful, he's responsible, and he's trustworthy. And that is exactly the kind of person that, again, if you're Darius, you're like, yeah, that person should be in charge of a nation. And so they concede the only way we're going to find something on him, and the only way we're going to be able to accuse him of something is if we're somehow able to connect it to his religion. And so they hatch this plan, and they appeal to Darius's ego. They get the king to sign off on this temporary law where it says that for the next 30 days, for the next month, basically prayer is illegal. Like, you can't pray to your God, you can't pray to anything except to Darius. Like, you could pray to Darius, you could bow down to him, but if you are caught praying, if you're caught, showing your devotion to any other god, well, here's what happens: is you're going to get fed to the lions. And for them, it's this perfect scheme because these guys know Daniel. They've seen the way he's lived his life over the decades, and so they already know what's going to happen. They know his character, and they know how time and time again he follows through on his convictions. But the question is for us is what do you do when you're certain, like absolutely no doubt in your mind, that doing the right thing, the thing that you ought to do, is going to cost you? Because once again, this is where Daniel finds himself. And it's in these moments where we go, okay, if I do the thing that I believe I'm supposed to do right now, well, it might cost me. It's in those moments that we discover who and what we are most committed to. We discover whether our integrity or our faith is disposable to us. But for Daniel, he actually doesn't really have much of a choice to make because, again, his mind was already made up. And so after this law is signed and Daniel learns of it, well, he goes home and he kneels with his windows open for all to see. And what does he do? He does what he usually does. He does what he's always done, and he decides that his faith will always be the thing that propels his actions towards. See, for Daniel, his primary concern was never the outcome of his decision. His primary concern was doing the right thing. It was not violating his conscience. It was being faithful to his God, even when it would cost him. And so Daniel, well, he's taken, and despite the king's reluctance, he's thrown into the den where the lions are at, where his faithfulness to God surely costs him his life. And I was thinking, as much suspense as I try to create right now, regardless of who you are, chances are you know how this story unfolds, right? Whether you go, yeah, I've read this story dozens of times, or you know what, I don't really know the Bible at all, but I've heard of Daniel in the lion's den, and I know that it's not like I've heard of that story because Daniel gets eaten, right? You go, I've heard of this story because God rescues him, and so it's because of that Daniel, well, he ends up being a hero, right? But the reality is that even before Darius finds Daniel alive in that den, Daniel had already won, right? Daniel was already a hero because for Daniel, the win was being faithful to God. The win was being somebody who would trust God regardless and place the outcome or the consequences in God's hand. And the thing that we have to remember is that when Daniel refused the king's food, and when Daniel decided that he would continue to pray to his God in spite of the law, that his only hope was that God would somehow intervene. And God had not promised to do that. And it was only because Daniel had the faith that he had and the commitment to God that he did that there was space for the miracle to take place. And it's only because he lived with that type of character and developed that type of moral authority that we would know his story now. And it's only because he resolved to be somebody who would not compromise his character or throw away his integrity that his life outlasted his own, and that 2.5 millennia later, we would be inspired to do the exact same thing. And so as we look at his life, we say, well, how did Daniel become an outlaster? And there's a few observations to make on it. The first one is that Daniel became an outlaster because he made up his mind ahead of time. Well before he found himself caving into the pressure and the temptations that were facing him in that moment, and he could easily talk himself out of it, Daniel's choice was already made for him. And I think so often, as I reflect, and maybe you think about your experience as well, we can live our lives one day in one decision, one opportunity, and one temptation at a time. And when we do, our success, our ability to win and to be faithful to God and do the right thing, it hinges often upon the willpower that we're able to muster up in that moment. But when we remember that one simple breach of integrity, it can easily lead to another. When we remember that the first time we cave into the temptation makes it increasingly more likely that we're going to do so in the future, when we remember that this allows harmful patterns to develop in our life and it sets us on a path that determines our trajectory, what happens is we see the need to make up our minds ahead of time, and so that we do not compromise our character. And the thing with Daniel is that the reason he was able to be the man that he was when he was 70 was because he had made up his mind when he was 17. When he was a kid, he had resolved to be a person who would develop moral authority. And he was able to make up his mind because he had identified the wind. And for Daniel, the win was to do what God has called me to do and to trust him with the consequences. And when we've already made up our minds ahead of time to do what God's called us to do, what he's instructed us to do, well, our options are actually limited because it automatically takes certain decisions and choices off of the table. But it also gives us great clarity when we're in situations that could otherwise be potentially dangerous for our integrity. And this reminds us of something that we see time and time again throughout Scripture. It's that the idea of winning or being successful, it often looks quite different from what we see around us in our world. Because for followers of Jesus, winning looks like faithfulness. It looks like obedience. It looks like placing complete confidence, not in our own abilities and not in our own willpower, but it places the confidence fully in God, and it trusts him with the outcome, with the consequences, with the results. And Daniel did just that. And he also became an outlaster because for him, integrity was never a means to an end. See, if our character, if our integrity is simply something that we do in order to get a happily ever after, that's not actually integrity. That's something else, right? And doing the right thing, it never guarantees we're going to see the results that we're hoping for. And it didn't for Daniel. See, he wasn't a hero because he escaped the lion's den. He wasn't a hero because he was not killed. He was a hero because he did the right thing even when he knew that doing the right thing might get him killed. Maintaining moral authority, it never ensures circumstantial outcomes. I mean, think about that. Maintaining authority, doing the right thing, it never ensures that the outcome you're hoping for is going to happen. But it does ensure that we will move closer to becoming the people that we're longing to become. The people who stand out for all the right reasons, people who remind others that there's a different way to live, a way of integrity, a way of honesty, a way of character, to be people whose influence will go beyond their time on this earth. And for Daniel, he had made up his mind ahead of time, and he knew what the most important thing was. He knew what the win was, and that made integrity a reflex. And so he caught the attention of the people who were looking on, and he began to develop moral authority with them. And that's the type of devotion to God and strength of character that causes someone to become a hero. And again, it was only because he behaved like a hero that there was even space for a miracle to exist. And what I believe is that we have the exact same opportunity that's in front of us. We have the opportunity to live lives that are going to outlast our own. Lives that our friends, our neighbors, our kids, our grandkids are going to talk about after we're gone because we've already made up our minds to do what we believe God has called us to do, and we've decided we're going to trust him with the outcome. And even though we may not always keep it fresh in our minds, one thing that I think we all kind of know this intuitively is that as we live our lives, is that people are actually watching. They're watching and they're observing. They're watching us at work. They're watching us in our apartment complex, in our neighborhood. They're watching the way we live in our homes, our family members. They're watching us in our classrooms, on our teams, and everywhere else. Is that we're being observed. And what I believe is that we're being watched by people who are very familiar with the ways of this world. Because we live in a world where certain things are true. We live in a world where people lie and cheat and steal to get ahead because everyone else is doing it, and that's what it means to win in this world. We live in a world where shady deals are done because people don't think twice about selling their integrity or their honor in this world because it's common. We live in a world where it's common for spouses to cheat because of the allure of a short-term thrill. And we live in a world where parents will leave their kids because they've been deceived into thinking that our own personal happiness is what matters most. We live in a world where leaders constantly set double standards because for some reason in our own world, do as I say, not as I do, that's acceptable in our world, right? And so people are looking at us. They're looking at us, especially if they know that we're Christians or followers of Jesus who believe that there's more to this world than this world, right? And they're watching the way that we live. And my hunch, this might not be true, but it's my hunch, and I think it is, it's that if they discover that we look a little too familiar, a little too common to the rest of the world, it's that we, and what we stand for, begin to lose influence. Because that type of life, the life that we see constantly around us in the world, I think while it is common, it's actually not very compelling. And we don't do what we've seen others do. That's what we decide. Because for many of us, we've seen this in our own lives, whether from afar or up close and personal. We've seen people whose moral authority with us, it seemed so strong, so robust, something that seemed like, man, like there is nothing that could shake this because they took years and decades building up that moral authority in our lives, but we saw it end up collapsing. And when it happens, just like a failure of structural integrity, it ends up transferring the stress and the weight to the other structures around it. A failure of personal integrity, it does exactly just that, and maybe sometimes has even worse outcomes. It always adds stress, it always adds weight, it always adds pain to the people who are surrounding us. And maybe for you, that was part of your story, is where you had a parent or a mentor or another family member, and their lack of moral authority, it caused a significant amount of pain or adversity for you. And the sad thing is that for some of us, this happened within a church, right? There was a leader who you learned from or you looked up to, and then because they just kept giving in to this pattern of little by little a compromise, or they had this underdeveloped integrity, it led to a downfall for them, but also disillusionment for you that you're still kind of grappling with. But what we've decided, and what I think you've decided is you go, you know what, that won't be my story. I won't let my life and my decisions harm the people around me. Instead, I'm going to live in such a way where people, you know what, I actually clear the way. I make sure I'm not leaving baggage behind me on the path, but I'm keeping it as clear as possible because I want to be an outlaster. And so therefore, I've got to have moral authority. But the quick little disclaimer is that we can never get that in a heartbeat, right? There's no way to microwave it. It always takes a bit of time. There's no shortcut to it. And just like resilience, in some ways, it's almost impossible to develop moral authority unless we're put in those moments where it's actually required of us. But I will say this, as I think about the people who I actually have a ton of respect for them, they have significant influence in my life, not because of positional authority, but because of the moral authority they've developed. I'm thinking of two things that they all have in common. So as we wind down, I want to throw out two places that we can start as we seek to develop moral authority. And the first one is a desire to grow that is marked by humility. See, character growth, it requires self-awareness and an ability to see areas for improvement. And this leads to people to be constantly thinking through questions. Questions like, okay, if I want to develop influence in this relationship, then what is it like to be on the other side of me? Okay, what type of positive and negative contributions am I bringing to, and then you fill in the blank. If I want to have influence here, what am I bringing to my workplace or my family or my friendships or my neighborhood or my church? What are the things that are holding me back? Sometimes that's it. That's what causes us to actually not have a certain amount of respect for somebody because we go, you know what? I see these things and there's not integrity with it. And sometimes it's an attitude where we go, oh, it's not lining up, or it's an appetite where they constantly give in to something that they know is not best for them, or it's an addiction, or it's just apathy of going, man, I actually want to respect them, but the way they live their life, they're just telling me they don't actually care. Or how about this? What are the blind spots, the areas of vulnerability, the places that I need to keep an eye on? And so these people, they're constantly wondering, how do I grow? How do I grow in my character so I can grow in my influence? How do I grow in love, in service, in righteousness? And that word gets a bad rap, but righteousness, it means a right relationship with other people and a right relationship with God. How do I grow in compassion? How do I grow in obedience? How do I grow, and this is something that I'm always praying for, how do I grow in a distaste towards sin or anything else that's going to create brokenness in me or the world around me? How do I grow so I just look at that and I go, that's disgusting. I don't want that. Because remember, as followers of Jesus, we don't seek to grow in our character or integrity to achieve something. We seek to do that in order to become someone who looks more and more like Jesus, someone who follows him fully and is transformed into his likeness. And here's the catch, that I think that this growth, it needs to be accompanied or marked by utter humility. Because people with strong moral authority are not people who are full of themselves, who look down on others, but instead they recognize that just like me and just like you, all of us are one dumb decision away from losing that moral authority. And so in light of that, we don't think that we're better than we are. And even if we feel like we're standing strong and we're in a good spot, we're careful that we don't want to fall because we're going to face the temptations that everybody else faces. And we know that pride or arrogance or a, hey, that could never happen to me attitude are the things that always precede our own fall. And as we humbly seek to grow, as you seek and ask to give God, or God to give you greater clarity, for you to be able to see and value what he sees and values, as you're more dependent upon his spirit and leadership and sensitive to his convictions, you, like Daniel, will be more likely to do what you ought to do, even when it's going to cost you. And one final point is that people who are marked by moral authority understand something. It's that when you mess up, you got to fess up, and you got to do it quickly. When you mess up, you fess up. So I spent about 10 or so years as a youth pastor, and I loved it. I loved the relationships I was able to develop with students, and it's something that I miss often. And a lot of the time, being youth pastor, it's just simply hanging out with students and figuring out how they're doing, what's going on in their life, what's good and what's not. And so oftentimes in those conversations where I'm hanging out with a teenager, as I'm asking, hey, what's rough right now? Won't be a surprise to you, but one of the things that would be very common in those conversations is life at home. Life at home is tough right now because I'm not getting along with my parents. And soon I quickly began to realize I need to filter that because not every parent is as evil or horrible probably as I'm hearing, maybe sometimes, but not every parent, right? And so I can specifically remember one time my wife and I are sitting with a student in our house, and she begins to talk about her parents. And I'm thinking, I know exactly where this is going right now. But as she starts to open up, she begins to talk about how the fact that even though there are things that she disagrees with her parents about, and even though her dad's pretty goofy, and even though there are still times, she goes, I absolutely respect my parents. And I was going, wow. Like, that's a breath of fresh air. She's like, I admire them, I look up to them. And specifically, she noted how big of a deal it was that she could remember from the time she was a little kid that when her parents made a mistake, whether something that affected her or just something that they saw, is that they would apologize, and they would apologize to her, even as a kid. And I remember hearing that and hearing the impression it made on a teenager and thinking, that's incredible, and it shaped the way that I wanted to parent. And I think when you catch yourself saying or doing as many oblivious or dumb or stupid things as I do, you got a lot of opportunities to step up to the plate. Maybe you can relate. And when you mess up, apologizing and doing it quickly, not till later on after the fact, but doing it quickly, I think it is one of the only ways that we can rebuild moral authority. Because think about it. We trust people who make mistakes. We don't demand perfection. We trust people who make mistakes, but we don't trust people who all they make is excuses, who it's never their fault. Followers of Jesus, here's what we know. We know that there's more to this life than this life. Thus, we want to live lives that are going to outlast our own. And we understand that in order to do that, we must have a resilience or a determination that keeps us going, especially when it's easy to give up. And we know that there's no greater way to influence the people in our lives than through the way that we live our lives. And so what is the missing piece of the puzzle? And how do we ensure that when we've run the race, what we've carried with us doesn't die with us? And to that I say, that is a great question. And you know what the answer is? The answer is right now. I've got 6 steps. I'm messing with you. You're like, you're already going long, man. All right. So the answer is next week, we're going to dive into that as we wrap up our series, Outlasters. So let me close us in prayer. Lord, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for the example that we get to read in Scripture of Daniel, of an ordinary person that you used to accomplish extraordinary things, all because he had made up his mind to be somebody who would live his life with integrity, somebody who would do the right thing even when it cost him. And so help us to resolve to build and to maintain moral authority in other people's lives. Help us to be people who are aware of the example that we set. Give us humility as we seek to follow you and become like you as we build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Scott. Wow, I'll tell you, I love that challenge, the challenge for us to live differently, right? And we're going to need God's help for that. And I think that one of the ways that God helps us with that is we're not doing it alone, but we're doing it together as a community, cheering each other on. And so it's just so great to be a part of Terra Nova in this walk that we have. As we wrap things up, there's some things that I just want to remind you about is that we'd love to have you know about is one of the things that we see here at Terra Nova again and again is people and how they are generous in our community and get to the chance to invest in Terra Nova through the offering. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. If you're here in the room as you walk out today, you'll be greeted by some guest service people that can take this giving envelope so you can give using the envelope. You can also give online or you can give during the app. And so we just want to make that available to you and just encourage you to be generous and just to team with us. Also, would love to have you hand in that Connect card that I talked about earlier. You can hand that again as you leave today. You can also use the online version. If you're watching online, you can use that version as well. And we would just love to hear from every one of you. And finally, if you found something that we've done in our gathering together helpful, useful, you might be thinking about who you can share the Terra Nova experience with. Certainly, it would be inviting someone to come to one of our gatherings, maybe next week and the weeks to come, but you can also very easily share the experience through our YouTube channel that you can go to, and we just encourage you to use that technology if you like YouTube. I know I like YouTube a ton. That's a great and easy way to say, hey, check out what I was doing last weekend, and I think that you'll be delighted with the results if you do that. Well, again, just want to thank you guys again so much for coming and being a part, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the exciting conclusion, part 4 of Outlasters next week and a great Labor Day weekend. Hope to see you there. God bless you guys. Have a great week.